Joseph Frimpong. My videos are found at www.thefunkyacademic.com. And I got a new idea because back in the 80s, there was a guy named Brian McGee who was a philosopher out in England, and he tried to popularize philosophy by having philosophers sit down and talk about their wares, and that was decent for philosophy. But now I think we can raise the level of the sea with respect to political thought. And as good as Brian McGee was, he was not funky. So we're going to have an in-studio interview today, and we're going to talk about social freedom, what freedom means, how we might be unfree in this life, although like we're in America, we're in the land of the free and the home of the brave, although there's a whole lot of anxiety going on for people who are supposed to be free. So I brought in an expert on freedom and the institutions of freedom and how to, like, the difference between a legitimate freedom and then kind of a false foisted upon us freedom. And this is Professor Richard Winfield. He is a professor at the University of Georgia, and we're going to talk about freedom today. So, Dr. Winfield, please. We are under the assumption right now that we are free. All right, we're in America. We're supposed to be free, and it's those other people who are unfree. In what ways are we unfree that aren't quite obvious, and that we've kind of been a kind of unfreedom that we've been acculturated into?
I think something that would be helpful in discussing the degree to which our freedom might be stunted is to think of what it is that the American Constitution mandates with regard to our freedoms, and what kind of freedoms and rights it has nothing to say about.
Okay.
Now, basically, the U.S. Constitution, reflecting its origins in the social contract tradition of political philosophy, tends to identify freedom with the freedom to dispose over property, and then to think, in addition, of one's freedom to participate in a government that will uphold our property rights.
Right. I can do what I want with my stuff, and the government will let me do what I want with my stuff.
And in which, in addition, which doesn't quite fit the social contract tradition, we have a government that does involve democratic participation.
Okay.
Although, of course, at the very outset, that was quite restricted, right? It was something that only pertained to white males who had a certain level of property. Those restrictions have been spread. But one thing that is, well, the domains that in no way are specified in the U.S. Constitution are the freedoms to which we're entitled as members of a family or household, and the freedoms that are specific to our social activities.
All right, so to be clear, the Constitution was very good, or at least articulate, in saying how we have freedom to dispose of our property, to do with our stuff with what we like, and we have freedom to participate in the rules governing how we are to dispose of our property.
And of course, to have, thanks to various amendments, certain guarantees regarding freedom of religious practice, political speech, and equal treatment under the law. But that still leaves wide open. What are our real entitlements as members of the family, as well as members of society? And in terms of society, we're dealing with rights that pertain to such things as our economic freedoms, our freedoms to engage in social interest groups, where we band together with others who share particular interests, and we act to, in some respect, promote the fulfillment of our shared interests in ways that do not undercut the social rights of others. Then our rights to, in a sense, participate in the civil legal process, where our social rights, our household rights, and our property rights are up for grabs and need to be enforced. And then the rights we have as individuals who are subject to the kind of public interventions that need to be made to enable us to actually exercise our economic freedoms, as well as our family freedoms.
So in our Constitution that actually enumerated all of the appropriate rights, you would not just deal with the property rights, we would also deal with the rights to organize, rights to, but we have an entire sphere of law, that's family law. Is that not appropriate?
But the question is, where does it have any constitutional guarantees? Of course, there is a sphere, but in terms of any, let's say, specification of rights that in a way should not be subject to removal by further statutory activity. We don't have those kind of guarantees. I think it's useful to think about the comparisons between the Universal Declaration of Rights that was drawn up under, in a sense, the leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt and was embraced by all the countries that were entering into the new United Nations. It has a much wider domain of rights that include those pertaining to social rights and household rights. That's not to say that the signers in any way are abiding by those rights, but it put on the table certain kinds of rights and the corresponding obligations of recognizing those rights of one's fellow members of society and so forth, that our Constitution has yet to fully absorb and guarantee.
So there is such a thing as family rights, and we know that there is such a thing as family rights because we have a family court that says, like, I'm allowed to treat my child differently than a stranger is allowed to treat my child.
And one has certain rights and duties with regard to a spouse that obviously are different from one's rights and duties with regard to one's lover, to whom one's not married, or to friends, or to strangers.
Good.
And all of these are relevant and
recognized. I can visit my wife in the hospital in a way that other people can't.
And this also pertains to who one is entitled to marry.
Right.
One of the latest advances in removing unjustified restrictions on the exercise of family freedom was to extend the right to marry to people who are not heterosexual.
And before that, it was laws against miscegenation.
And of course, there were obviously all sorts of inequalities built into the marital relationship pertaining to gender differences and the like, which have, to a large extent, been removed. But if you think about the way in which our economic activity is allowed to operate, it still operates in a way that makes it very difficult for members of society to fulfill their family rights and duties, especially women, given the realities of childbirth and, care for children at the very outset.
So in
breastfeeding and the like.
Yeah. So in a well-ordered sphere of rights, all of these different spheres of right are interdependent and don't kind of encroach upon the other.
Yeah.
I should be able to fulfill my rights as a spouse to my spouse,
Yes.
and also at the same time fulfill my social rights, and also at the same time be able to participate in a democracy in a way that's appropriate and
but the partialities that are legitimate within the household are not legitimate to intrude into social opportunities or political opportunities. Then it becomes a nepotism which has a negative significance.
Right.
Likewise, one's economic freedoms and one's pursuit of wealth and earning and so forth should not be allowed to intrude into the sphere of politics where it could have any unequal impact upon one's political options and political opportunities. So in this respect, each type of freedom needs to be maintained within its sphere and not be allowed to intrude beyond it. And only then can we actually really exercise our political self-determination and have equal political opportunity. Every type of entitled freedom, since none of them are privileges, involve a kind of equal opportunity.
Right.
So we are entitled to equal opportunities with regard to our role as spouses, as parents with regard to our children, as members of society, with regard to our economic opportunities, our opportunities to engage in social interest group and advocacy, our status before civil law, and as well as beneficiaries of any kind of public administration of welfare, and then of course our opportunities to participate in democratic self-governance.
All right, so if I work a job and my job precludes me from leaving to go vote, you would say that that's an infringement on my rights.
Yeah, I mean, clearly if one's either family rights and duties or social rights and duties are not going to prevent one from participating on equal footing with others in the political sphere, certain kinds of adjustments have to be made. And that means, on the one hand, that one's family rights and responsibilities and social rights and responsibilities have to be so fashioned that all citizens have the time, in some respect, to participate in politics. And that means not only having some free time to do so, but also to be provided with the resources to engage in political activity. So, for example, it's not enough to say that we can all have universal suffrage, right? We supposedly have the right, all of us, to run for office. But it's no accident that if you look at who our representatives are, they now, for the first time, have become, on average, millionaires. Because how can one afford to run for office, especially given how long political campaigns are, when to do so, one has to stop doing one's work,
Right.
if one's really going to do it seriously.
Right.
But unless you have your own particular legal practice,
Right.
where you might be able to continue working and earning income, you find yourself bereft of income, and in all likelihood bereft of the opportunity to return to resume your job, either if you lose or after having served. So something has to be done if we're really going to all have the opportunity to participate in politics and vie for political office. You know, candidates, I mean, people who qualify for candidacy have to be provided with the means to live during their political campaign.
As a matter of right.
As a matter of right, because if you're not given the means to exercise your rights are being violated.
And that's a wrong. That's a criminal.
And that is a wrong. If it's done intentionally, of course, it amounts to a criminal wrong. If it's not done intentionally, it's a non-malicious wrong, but a wrong that still involves liability for damages.
We're going to get into this, people, because he just made some provocative statements. But first, I need you, if you're watching on Facebook, to like this video so that other people see it on their Facebook page, and share this video. And it's going to be later available on my YouTube channel. You can just, go to YouTube and put in IRAMI, that's IRAMI, or The Funky Academic. I'll come up, become a subscriber, because we hope to do this more often. But please like and share this video. And if you really like what we're doing, go to www.thefunkyacademic.com and decide to kick in and become a monthly member for a few dollars a month. But let's get back to what you suggested about rights. That means a few things. One, we're talking about something more robust than expecting my employer to pay me for jury duty, or to not fire me or punish me for jury duty. You're expecting it to be the case that if my employer intentionally withholds my right to go exercise my suffrage, or punishes me for running for office, that employer might be criminally liable for infringing on my right, actually doing a wrong to me.
Well, we have to think about whether the entire burden of providing individuals with the resources they need to
falls on the employer.
Good. Now, in our country, we have tended to locate the furnishing of various kinds of guarantees, such as health care, health insurance, such as a pension, such as sick leave and so forth, on one's workplace and employer. And I think the reason for this is that we as a nation, unlike some other nations, have failed to make it a matter of public guarantee that all residents will be provided with the health care they need simply in order to exercise any of their freedoms, with the kind of sick leave they need, and also with the kind of pension to allow them to have replacement income when they're no longer able to work. Now, because we haven't done that, employees were the ones who fought tooth and nail, essentially through their unions, to compel their employers to offer these benefits. The employers were not going to do it, even if you have an employer who would like to.
No.
There's a basic principle of business ethics that I guarantee is not taught in any business school, and it is that businesses can be ethical and viable only if all businesses are required to provide the ethical treatment to their employees, to the consumer, to the environment, because only if it's a universal mandate will no business suffer additional expenses by doing the right thing and fall prey to the forces of competition of those who are leaner and meaner.
All right, so you're going to run into problems with universal mandates in a globalized economy.
Well, I mean, you're right. In some respect, one wants to push for them to be as universal as possible through universal treaties and the like.
Right.
But every nation has the possibility of curtailing the forces of competition from outside one's borders by making use of one's authority over foreign commerce. That doesn't mean one has to be completely protectionist, but one does have resources to contend with those kind of issues. Ideally, the way of solving it, if one wants to avoid any kind of protectionism, is to get international agreements that somehow deal with this. But we are in a world where there are great discrepancies in wealth, discrepancies in wage levels, and so forth and so on. Obviously, it is a real challenge. But there are ways for it to be met without, in a sense, abandoning the enforcement of the rights to which all are deserved. And this obviously is a universal human question, right? It's not resolved by saying we're going to just focus on America first,
Right.
and who cares about employees and everyone else, right?
Interdependent.
It is something that requires that, and in a way that makes it more feasible to get these kind of international agreements.
Right. But let's talk a little bit more about how robust these rights would have to be for them to be legitimate and make sense. That means, for example, in Flint, Michigan,
Yes.
where you could draw a line between the governor's decision and maybe the EPA's decision to kind of ignore the findings and pass them along, they would be held somehow responsible for committing a wrong,
Yes.
like in a criminal way.
Yeah, I mean, there are two ways in which it could be criminal. They could be criminally negligent,
Right.
where it wasn't that they intentionally wanted to give the residents of Flint water that would poison them, but they were just not doing their proper duties of seeing what were the actual health conditions of the water supply, which they have a responsibility to take care of.
And that's more than a civil.
Yeah, that certainly could involve criminal prosecution.
Okay.
But on the other hand, we're dealing with a community that is suffering from mass poverty, and poverty itself is a wrong.
Right.
And when I speak of poverty being wrong, one has to think of it not as a matter of being deprived of the necessities of life,
Okay.
because one can have all the necessities of life provided and still be poor. Because what poverty really signifies as a wrong is that it involves a hindrance of one's ability to exercise one's rightful opportunities.
So all of the formal rights we have,
Yeah.
but that we can't exercise because we don't have money for a lawyer, or you don't have money
Exactly.
to pay your healthcare
Yeah.
premium, or
Yeah.
to actually buy a house. Like
Now-
all of these
yeah.
formal rights,
Yeah.
you're saying they're just not
Yeah.
substantive enough. You're
Yeah.
not,
Now,
it's
of
not
course,
serious.
all of this depends upon what are the so-called background conditions with regard to how we deal with the provision of health care, the provision of, for example, legal aid.
Right.
I mean, all of these and in some respect, the provision of affordable housing. All of this, in a sense, has an impact on how these things are furnished. Are they going to be furnished solely by the income of individuals, or will it be furnished by drawing upon wider sources of wealth, which can be done if we follow the lead of some other countries, which have, for example, made healthcare something publicly guaranteed, and not something that is provided by the workplace in some fashion or other.
Let's go after one of the more provocative ideas I've heard you espouse, and think of the exercise of legal rights
Yeah.
being a right. That means it needs to be recognized. That means we need some sort of provision for access to a lawyer.
Yeah.
That means
And I think we have to recognize the importance of rights to legal representation, because what happens in the courts, here we have the place where rights get legally enforced. And without legal enforcement of one's rights, those rights can be an empty word on pieces of paper.
right.
They have to be legally enforced, because they can always be violated in two ways. Either on purpose in a malicious manner, which is a criminal offense, or non-maliciously, just inadvertently, which is still a wrong, which requires some kind of liability and some way of redressing the harm. Now, if the furnishing of legal representation in any way depends upon one's own private wealth, and there are significant differences in wealth, then that clearly means that we are not all equal before the law. That's even true if, thanks to constitutional guarantees, we are all provided with representation for criminal cases. So if we can't afford defense in a criminal case, it will be provided by the state. But the way that's provided involves, on the one hand, legal aid lawyers, who, generally speaking, are relatively underfunded compared with the more affluent corporations of lawyers,
Right.
who have tremendous caseloads, who don't have resources to engage in investigations outside of court.
And all of this will be
preparing
guaranteed to each individual as a right?
Well, the thing is, we have to think about how we can ensure that, first of all, in criminal cases,
Right.
individuals have access to equal quality of representation. And this needs to be extended to civil cases, because civil cases are just as important as criminal cases, because they involve the same harms, right? Whenever there's a harm, that could involve death, it could involve disability, it could involve losing control over your children, it could involve all sorts of property settlements with spouses, all sorts of other issues.
So what
All of these things, your rights are in jeopardy if you cannot make use of the court system to uphold your rights in civil cases.
So what you're talking about is, as a right, you want legal care to be something on the model of single-payer healthcare, or just care. So I can, if I have to pay a $10 or $5 non-prohibitive copay, $5 to go see a lawyer, I should be able to do that, and that lawyer should be actually of quality, not just.
Right. I think the advantage of having a system of legal insurance, in a way that's completely analogous to a single-payer system of health insurance, is that, to begin with, under this kind of system, you would have access to any legal practitioner, just as in a single-payer health system.
In my
you have
network.
access to any, there's no network, to any healthcare provider. And moreover, they would be reimbursed for their services in terms of rates that are established, in terms of negotiations between groups of lawyers and the government in this case, or whatever is administering the body of this kind of public insurance. And it can be funded by those who are most able to fund the services.
You're talking about a graduated income tax.
Through a graduated, not just graduated income tax, graduated wealth tax.
Okay.
Because the discrepancies in wealth are far greater than discrepancies in income.
Right.
And I think it's crucial that this great accumulation of wealth at the high end that has happened in the last decades, where the American economy has more than doubled,
Like in your
yet
lifetime,
wages have
seen
remained
it.
stagnant, which is to say there's been a great shift of wealth from those who are receiving wages to those who are the most affluent. And it's only fair that some of this added wealth be employed to give everyone a real defense of their rights, which requires legal representation that's on a par with anyone else's legal representation. I think, again, that can be best done not by legal aid, not by court-appointed lawyers who operate on a pro bono basis, because that's not exactly going to be, the focal point of their interest. You can't count on that.
And they'll be overwhelmed with court load. Yeah.
But if in a sense we have this kind of legal insurance, it'll operate just like a single-payer health plan. You have access to any practitioner, and the rates would, in a sense, be negotiated. And that would be another way to keep legal costs relatively efficient and not allow them to balloon out of proportion, just as one could do the same thing with medical costs.
And to be clear, this isn't a terribly radical idea, and it can be legitimized through just thinking about what rights are meaningfully. And it's not that much different than Social Security. And like the first time someone said we should have Social Security.
But remember, Social Security obviously was intended to give people something that is more secure than any pension paid for by a private enterprise.
Right.
Because a private enterprise can always go belly up. It can refuse to meet its obligations. Social Security was intended to be genuinely secure, and the fluctuations of the market and the stock market in particular could not affect it. After all, this was something instituted after the Great Depression. But it still was instituted in a way that is connected to jobs, because in some respect, you pay contributions into the fund, and that has something to do with how much you get out at the end.
Right.
And one has to recognize that, first of all, there were many people who were earning a living which did not involve paying into the fund in any respect.
Oh yeah, I mean
farm workers, domestic workers,
yes.
Which meant in particular those discriminated groups who had to rely on that kind of employment.
Right.
They're going to get lower Social Security payments as a result. But I think, again, we should think more of a system that will not be tied to jobs and so forth. And again, we can think of a kind of Social Security where, in effect, everyone gets a living replacement wage. There would be tantamount to, in a sense, what would be something like at least the livable minimum wage.
Right.
And I think in current circumstances, it's ludicrous to think that the minimum wage could be less than $15. I think $20 is more reasonable, frankly, if anyone thinks of how they can get by on less than that.
And still exercise all of the rights and not just barely survive, but actually And that's $20 with a job that will allow you to both fulfill your household duties and engage in your political...
Which requires certain adjustments.
Right.
For example, there would have to be mandatory paid vacation, sufficient to give you time to be with your family, also if you want to engage in politics.
Right.
There would also have to be guaranteed paid parental leave. 9 months would be sufficient.
This is what, if
Perhaps.
we care about freedom, these are the kinds of discussions we need to have.
And then on the other hand, we have to provide the child care and in a sense, you could say elder care,
Yes.
without which members of families just can't have a time to free themselves from dealing with these duties and exercise either their social freedom or their political freedom.
Good.
So these things have to go together so that it's possible to exercise all one's freedoms in these different spheres without one sphere overwhelming and destroying one's opportunities in the other.
And we're going to end actually talking about clarifying what a right to work means.
Yeah.
Right? I just read an article yesterday, and I think it was in SF Gate, about an Uber worker who, for a few days a week says bye to their family.
Yeah.
They drive into a city, it was in San Francisco, but I think the general claim was that it was happening not just in San Francisco, but in New York, Chicago, a lot of expensive cities. They drive Uber all day and then sleep in a Safeway or a Walmart parking lot, and then because they can't afford to actually live in the city that they work in, and then they do it again for rush hour the next day. And some people say that this person is free, and this person has a right to work, and they're exercising that right to work. And you would say it's not that simple.
Well, when I speak of the right to work, I'm not directly addressing the question of how one's income is sufficient to provide for affordable housing.
Right.
I mean, ensuring that there is affordable housing is, in some respect, an independent issue.
Right.
But what I have in mind with the right to work is that, in a sense, the market is an institution where we're able to do something you can't do without markets. You can't do in traditional societies, where the occupation you engage in, what goods you have, is not determined by your choice, but is determined by what kind of group you're born into and various other kinds of traditional restrictions. But in the market, you have the opportunity to be able to choose how you're going to earn a living, what you're going to do, what kind of things you're going to seek. But the market in and of itself does not always allow you to exercise that opportunity. And if you can't exercise your opportunity, your right to do so is violated.
But you have an opportunity. You're an American. You have an opportunity.
Well, the market always, given the very dynamic of competition, which requires firms to continually transforming the way in which they produce goods so they can lower production costs. They have to develop new products. They have to develop new marketing techniques. There's a continual upheaval taking place, which inevitably is going to involve some people losing their work. They're no longer going to be skilled to do what is required. There's no way you can count on market activity guaranteeing everyone employment.
Right.
And now we're standing before two types of challenges that make the specter of job destruction even more grim. And one of them is automation, which obviously has already amazingly reduced the amount of labor necessary in agriculture. It used to be something that involved almost all the workforce in the 19th century. Now less than 1.5% of the workforce are engaged in agriculture. Manufacturing has become highly automated, so that the number of jobs that have been in decline in manufacturing, which now occupies maybe 12% of the working population, that loss is due 85% to automation. Not to outsourcing, which accounts for 15, but automation. And now automation is poised to move into the service sector, which makes up more than 80% of employment. And it's estimated that almost 50% of jobs in the service sector will succumb to automation. And then you have the gig economy.
The gig economy.
We're
entrepreneurial, right?
Yeah, we're supposedly entrepreneurs, but what it really means is that because of the internet and various other technological advances, employers can get rid of full-time workers who involve all sorts of nuisances and benefits, and just have freelancers and pay them in a piecework way for services they provide.
We might have to do another episode just on what we lose when we lose full-time workers and the concept of full-time workers. But go on.
Well, anyway, you can see that the right to work is very much in jeopardy. And if we're going to recognize that it's a right, and it's a fundamental right, and in a way, it's a right that if it's secured, allows for all sorts of things to be done, because any time you impose upon the market or business certain requirements, you will always be met with the answer that, well, this is going to lead to job loss, because companies are not going to be able to provide for the environment, be environmentally protective, allow flexibility in work without laying people off because of the additional costs. Well, one has to eliminate that problem.
That whole line of argument you want to eliminate with one fell swoop.
By publicly guaranteeing employment at a living wage to all who are able and willing. Now, this would not involve having jobs that are going to compete directly with what's already going on in the private sector. That would be counterproductive.
Right.
It would just foster new unemployment.
Okay.
It has to be a matter of providing the kind of public goods that profit-seeking enterprises are neither willing nor able to provide.
We're talking about make-work jobs.
Well, not make-work. Rather, doing jobs for all of the goods that are necessary to promote our rights. I mean, think of all the substandard housing, lack of affordable housing, eliminating the problem of homelessness. All sorts of things could be constructed that the real estate market and home builders are not able to make a profit on currently, right? Likewise, caring for individuals who are by themselves, the elderly, providing aid in schools, getting involved in all sorts of public works without turning America into one big toll road, as our current president seems to want to do with his supposed public works program. You know, there's no shortage, and we can look at it as a kind of anticipation of what could be done. To go back, you know, to the 1930s when Roosevelt came out with the WPA, the Works Project Association, which put 8 million people to work, and of all sorts, artists, writers, lawyers, whatever, and producing the kind of public goods that we still take advantage of today. And there's room for all of that, and think of what a new birth of freedom this would represent, where everyone coming of age knows they will have a meaningful job available to them. Anyone coming back from the armed services will know they will have a meaningful job awaiting them. They won't have to face homelessness. Everyone coming out of prison will have a meaningful job awaiting them. It'll be possible to earn a living legally.
Yeah.
And there will be no temptation to have to resort to anything else.
Right. And this the entire line of argument that we can't expect corporations, even in the private sector, to behave appropriately because it would lead to job loss. That line of argument's gone.
Yeah. So I think this is actually a keystone. It's not sufficient by itself, but it's absolutely necessary and indispensable.
It would also take away the pressure to earn a college degree that I think shunts a few too many people to college, and especially in debt.
Well, look, we have to remember that the United States population, less than a third of the population actually finishes a college degree. It may well be that 50% begin.
But everyone feels the pressure.
But you know, we're slipping very much in terms of our comparison with other nations, other developed nations. Many more of their young are going to college than in the United States and getting the degrees.
Right.
But that brings up the question of the affordability of training and education. And you know, one can generally there's several approaches one can take. One is to simply provide those who are in need the funding to enable them to have access to education.
Right.
Or one can make it free for all, just as we decided as a country to do with regard to K through 12 education, right? And I think if you make it free for all, we make all public universities free, all public technical institutions, colleges free, that allows it to be something that can gain universal support on the one hand and not stigmatize those who are going to be the ones who need support out of need.
Good.
And I think that approach is politically more feasible and superior in all respects.
And so you're talking about a right to work that guarantees jobs that are politically determined. We come together and decide what needs to be done in the community.
Yeah, it can be done nationally because there are things of national scope.
Right.
But it can be done on the state, it can be done in the local community.
And these jobs would have to pay enough so that you could exercise all of your other rights.
Yeah. Now, of course, how much is required has to do with how we provide health care, how we provide legal aid, and so forth.
Right.
You know, do we make it something which is paid for out of the wages of individuals, or is it paid for by a different source? But again, we're talking about what has to be a living wage, and these guaranteed jobs, they would have to be paid at what in effect would be the new minimum wage. And it should also be what people who cannot work should be receiving. They should be receiving the same livelihood. Because there are people who just are not able to work. And they deserve to be supported so they can exercise their rights.
Right. And now
and we're talking about the abolition of poverty. The actual abolition of poverty.
As a matter of right.
As a matter of right.
And respecting rights.
And not as something that is impossible. It's not impossible. It can be done. And if you look at how much wealth we as a country have, we consist of less than 5% of the world's population. We have 40% of the world's wealth. There's an immense amount that can be pooled, of course, not only for us, but for things that are helpful to the world at large.
And let's be honest, building a dignified working class, a lot of that money will be spent.
Well, that's the other thing.
It generates like an economy.
What's completely false about the trickle-down economic theory is that the more you have economic inequality, the more economic stagnation you have. And the reason is that the 1% can only spend so much of their money on golden toilet seats on which to go on Twitter, right? They can't spend that much of their wealth, whereas those of more modest means spend much more of their wealth. So if the wealth is redirected to those who are not the super wealthy, it's going to go back into the economy. There's going to be a multiplier effect. There'll be more demand for goods. This will encourage higher production, investment, and so forth. It's no accident that our rate of growth has declined as we become less equal.
All right. So
these are important features.
I'm gonna excuse me. I'm gonna wrap this up a little bit and let the people go on with their day. So to be clear, in this video we've talked about there are multiple spheres of right. We acknowledge them in some ways. We're very good at acknowledging property rights, the ability to dispose of property as you may, as you would like, and the ability to participate, at least in a shallow way, in democracy. We're less articulate about talking about other rights that are still acknowledged. For example, family rights, the special rights and duties you owe to your spouses and your kids that you don't owe to strangers. And then how these spheres of right, and then also there would be social rights, which include employment rights and maybe the right to organize your workforce to bargain for a better standard of care in your workforce. And so we're less clear about how these different spheres of rights interact with each other, and then allow for also the exercise of political rights. So a better democracy, a better discourse around rights would consider the differences in these kinds of rights at a constitutional level, and then make publicly known how they're supposed to interlock. Is that accurate?
Yes. And I just might mention one thing we did
Yes.
not discuss,
Yes.
which is of crucial importance, is the question of facilitating a universal unionization of employees.
Okay.
And we can discuss that at some future time.
Good. Well, thank you for your time, and hope to see you back in the studio soon.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and thank you. And look, if you like what we're doing here, if you want us to do it more, this video will be available on thefunkyacademic.com and also on YouTube, and we'll go on Facebook Live now. Tell your friends and share the video so that other people know the kind of quality of discourse that I think the nation needs, so that maybe we make better, more meaningful decisions going forward in our political life. Thank you for taking the time to watch. Thank you for taking your day with us, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.